Welcome to session number 3 in the EAIE Community Summit series. My name is Laura Rumbley. I'm Associate Director for Knowledge Development and Research at the European Association for International Education, and I'm very much looking forward to guiding us collectively through our conversation today on crafting optimal solutions for marketing and recruitment in the face of change. So, on to the conversation at hand. We're kicking off this conversation on marketing and recruitment in the face of change in a conversation with Kimmo Kuortti. For those of you who may not know Kimmo, he's head of Global Education Solutions at Oulu University of Applied Sciences in Finland, where he's previously held the positions of Director of International Relations and Director of Student Recruitment. He's active as a lecturer and is currently a steering group member in the EAIE expert community on marketing and recruitment. Kimmo, it's wonderful to have you joining us from Finland today.
Hi, Laura, and hello, everybody else. Glad to be here. Really nice. And thank you for a great day yesterday already.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kimmo. To give us a sense of matters of marketing and recruitment and how they're playing out across our community, you and I decided that it might be interesting to get some input from participants here today about what they're thinking about in terms of their own institutional realities. So in order to get everyone involved in this conversation, we'd like to direct your attention first and foremost to the polling question that should be appearing on the screen here shortly, that we'd like all of you to register a reaction to. And the question that you should be seeing on the screen here is to what extent the COVID-19 crisis and related developments have affected your institution's approach to its international marketing and recruitment activities, particularly for the coming year. So some of you might be indicating that these events have had a great impact on what you're planning on doing. There's been only a moderate adjustment of approaches to marketing and recruitment, perhaps only a small adjustment, or maybe really no changes at all that you're anticipating for the coming year. I wonder what you imagine as a possible set of responses here, Kimmo, as we wait for people to register their reactions.
Yeah, that's a good question. Let's see if I get somewhere close. There are aspects in marketing and recruitment where I think the effect has been greater, where people have changed, and institutions have changed their strategies. On other areas, there might not be that much. I think it really depends on, as often is with polls, it depends on what the person answering is thinking about when they choose. I know this is a cunning way of avoiding to giving the false answer, so to speak, myself, or making a false bet, if you like. But let's see what happens. Well, interesting.
Yeah. Our results are on the screen here, and there's kind of an even split at the top here. What are you seeing here?
Yeah. This is interesting. It's currently 44% of the answers are saying to a great extent. So to what extent has COVID crisis and related developments affected our international marketing recruitment? 44% clearly, and to a moderate extent, 42%. So that's huge.
Yeah,
that is almost 90. Exactly, yeah. So clearly there's been a lot of things. So I'm really looking forward to all those discussions in the breakout rooms as well, and the stuff produced in Padlet afterwards to see what are those things. This is actually very fascinating.
Really, and I actually wonder, Kimmo, how would you personally have answered that question for your own institution? Has Oulu made a significant change in the way it's going to approach marketing and recruitment for the coming year?
In our case, I would say to a moderate extent. I would have to say due to the program where I work and the part of the institution where I work, whereas the entire institution, the top level, if you like, the central level, has definitely made, probably to a great extent, would be their answer, I would imagine.
So actually that response really does open up some interesting avenues that we may unpack over the course of our conversation, that it may be hard to answer for an entire institution. There may be variations across. And so that, I think, can be some of the subtleties that people get into, as you say, in their breakout discussions.
Well, exactly. And that's one of the great things about the membership of EAIE as well, because people are from various levels and parts of the institutions. So it's a rich conversation usually.
For sure. So I had mentioned to you as we were preparing for this session that I was reflecting on what for me are kind of two fascinating cornerstones of what my layperson's understanding of marketing and recruitment is. And that is, I've always been very fascinated with the component that has to do with the storytelling around an institution and how it puts itself out into the world. And of course, there is the dimension of marketing and recruitment that really goes down into some very specific targets and objectives and measurable numbers about how recruitment has gone, for example. So I would like to follow up on those two dimensions in our conversation a little bit, starting first with the bit more concrete one of international student recruitment. And I was wondering if you might be able to reflect on your network, your understanding of the field, your personal relationships, to give a sense of some examples of innovation and good practice that are being undertaken when it comes to international student recruitment activities, as both institutions and prospective students are really facing some very unusual circumstances.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and I find I start briefly with what you started with the two sides, if you like. Let's just call them now simply hard side and the soft side, if you like. The story side and the numbers side, if you like, as you put them, is what is fascinating, I think, exactly. And when those sides work together, and they are very often slightly different people. Sometimes you have both in one person in marketing recruitment, but sometimes you have the team. And when those work together, you indeed craft the optimal solutions for your institution. And I think there are good examples. I've looked at Finland a little bit and had a discussion with my colleagues. And what, for instance, Tampere University did was they ran a survey on their admitted new students who are supposed to start next autumn, and wanting to understand what are their plans, what are their worries, and then more concretely, what kind of financial situation there might be, and practical things. What are the practical things that worry them? And simply to understand what they actually worry about, and therefore to adjust and plan at Tampere University's own measures in what do we need to do now in view of the new students, and of course, when developing new campaigns, recruitment of the next cohort. We don't know yet how this situation plays out, how this continues, but to be on the safe side and to know and to understand what do we need to take into account when we are then targeting and recruiting new people, the next cohort, not just this one. So I think that was an interesting example, simply asking students a bit more than before. University of Helsinki, on the other hand, has, for instance, strengthens their digital, if you like, presence even. And University of Helsinki, I talked with Mats, that some of you might actually know as well. And Mats used a phrase, he said, like reaching out digitally in person. Well, it was sort of inverted commas, reaching out digitally in person. But I think it's well put. It is well put, and it is a challenge too. Of course, how do you reach out now that you can't reach out actually in person? How do you reach out digitally in person? And how do you engage, for instance, alumni, your current students, to create that personal, and I'm not saying just personal feeling, it's a personal digital reality that you just have to accept that. And that was another interesting example. Higher School of Economics, for instance, then in St. Petersburg, has invested a lot in live events, because we have a lot of platforms that we can use for that. We have Instagram Live, we've got Facebook Live, number of things that you can actually do to bring the live feeling of your offering, of your campus, of your services. So reaching out in different ways seems to have gotten funnily enough, more important or gotten more focus now that you can't actually go and meet people. You can't go to fairs and visit campuses and so on and so forth. Those are a couple of examples that I found interesting and that highlight the situation.
Absolutely, and they really do harken back to conversations we had yesterday with Claire O'Leary in regard to student engagement and support, and the idea that professionals who are working in other areas, not necessarily marketing and recruitment, but in direct services with students, are really thinking a lot about that way, the ways that they can connect personally, the ways that they can forge relationships with students, and help them feel part of something in a personal sense. So I think that's
Exactly.
interesting to see it across different areas.
Absolutely.
So as you've been speaking, there's actually a question that has popped into the Q&A box that relates directly to what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Our poll asked people to think about their plans for recruiting. The question is, are there institutions still really recruiting for next year, or isn't it more about retention at this point? I wonder if it is really trying to keep connected to those individuals who had already applied and been admitted potentially. I wonder what your thoughts are about that, Kimmo.
No, absolutely. That is a very good point. Once again, I mean, one of the things that we just simply have to think about in the student recruitment is, and in this situation, is the short term and the long term. I mean, the short term, absolutely, yes. You are actually focusing on retention. How do we make sure that the students will start? How can we make sure that they don't defer or simply go away and apply later? How can you do that in a meaningful way? But that, of course, that relates to a lot of things apart from marketing and recruitment. But then again, marketing and recruitment is not only about whatever fancy websites and campaigns or whatnot. It is of university. So how do we get the students start in a meaningful,
Kimmo,
in a good way?
we've lost your sound for a moment. I wonder if you might be able to
Is it
double
back now?
check.
Is it back now?
Let's see if we can get his sound back.
How's the sound now?
You're back. Thank you. Sorry,
Am I
just
back?
want to make
Okay.
sure we've got
Interesting. I don't know what happened. Yeah, marketing recruitment is not just about some campaigns and marketing recruitment effect. It is about the whole brand of the university, the pedagogy. How do we get the students to start in a meaningful way? That's the important. That's the retention part. But of course, in the long run, we absolutely have to think about how are we going to get the next cohort, and how are we going to do that? Of course, bring them to a meaningful academic experience. So we plan both things at the same time. While we're doing the retention, we are actually preparing for making it even better for the next cohort should the situation continue. So the short-term, long-term aspect you need to take into account all the time.
Sounds good. And by the way, I'm getting pinged from all sides that the dropout in sound was on me. So we're living in a complicated technical environment. And
Okay.
Apologies for slowing things down when other people.
Oh, great! I'm so happy coming from Finland with wireless wonderland. So I'm happy it wasn't me.
Absolutely. So a couple of other questions along these lines are, popping into the Q&A. You've mentioned this idea of connecting in person digitally, and someone was wanting perhaps an example about how that might be done. Would that be in a one-on-one Zoom conversation? Any ideas about some specifics where that might happen?
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, people from a number of universities, I'm sure I could give examples as well. What I've seen and what I know of is indeed having quite a number of person-to-person or person-to-group, I mean, meaning a person to a student group, conversations, webinars, seminars, whatever you want to call them, possibilities for people to contact and ask questions, express what's worrying about them, but also using, for instance, your alumni abroad, the alumni who's graduated, facilitating them to organize these digital person-to-person conversations.
Fantastic. Please keep these questions coming into the Q&A box because they're really feeding an excellent conversation.
Lovely.
There's another kind of a specific technical question that someone's put forward with respect to any recommendations you might have about how many social media channels an institution might want to be active on, and any particular social media channels that you think are worth discussing here.
Yeah, it's a great question. Obviously, we know that, first of all, you need to be present in those social media channels that your target group is present in. And that, of course, varies. First of all, varies according to your target group. Or is your target group people who are looking for instance, let's say, their first study place, their bachelor? Is it people who are looking for a master's degree, or are you recruiting, let's say, PhD program, or for instance, in-service training, further education? Once again, that really is important. And then The second thing is obviously, what is your geographic area? So what kind of platforms are used in the geographic area that you're targeting at? Is it China? Is it Russia? Is it Southeast Asia? Wherever. So there's unfortunately not one answer to that, because the platforms that I use, or people of my age use, for instance, are definitely not the ones, or for most part, not the ones that the youngsters use. And one has to also remember that it is also about what people do in those platforms. How do they, let's say, consume the internet? And that's very important as well. How receptive are they to your, if it's blunt marketing message in, let's say, Instagram? How receptive might they be? Might they be actually irritated when they see that? So how do you forge also your message to suit the platform and the target group, so that it actually reaches out to them and doesn't, in fact, irritate them, is of course the issue. But I hope we'll have in the future actually good EAIE training sessions on these things, where we can actually talk about these things in detail in relation to these markets and the geographic markets and the target groups.
It seems like it'd be a very interesting area, as you say, that the knowing your audience piece of things, the intelligence gathering component of the work, crucial to whether or not there's an impact for what you're doing. One more question with respect to recruitment that's been put forward has to do with something we can't do in the moment. There's a suggestion that we could have done another poll that would ask how many institutions are actually considering shifting focus in their recruitment efforts to off-cycle starting dates. So January of next year, spring, more broadly speaking. I wonder if you've had a chance to connect with any colleagues who are pursuing those lines of action at this time.
Yeah, that's another one. Well, I can actually say that as from my own institution and from my own program, which is vocational teacher education, we have actually thought about that, and we've had the January starting, which is not that atypical, but still not typical for us. We've had that in mind definitely, because a lot of people have been asking about that, obviously. But once again, this is, at least at this point for us, a short-term thing. This is one of those short-term plans. And our management still does not believe that this dramatic situation will continue for long. So it's simply to question, okay, shall we offer the option of starting in January as well? As we have not a huge number, but we do have people who actually have requested that, have said that, they are not they're not happy about starting in the autumn, and they would prefer start in January. So we have definitely talked about that. Whether that's a big issue or not, or a major concern in the institutions, I do not know. But that would be very interesting to hear in the comments, and I hope we have it in the chat box where people could react actually to this thing, to have an unofficial poll, if you like.
Exactly. No, that would be very nice. And I do appreciate what you're saying again about this idea of reacting to needs in the moment, whether or not this would be a permanent shift in ways of working, or a way of responding to current needs. Again, that came up in our session yesterday on student support, responding now to what's necessary.
Well, exactly. And that's one of the things that makes it the situation is a bit stressful. It's something that we in a way have to acknowledge as well. We don't know. We just simply don't know things at the moment. And to be able to live with that insecurity and still plan ahead, keep on doing meaningful things, that's a big challenge for all of us, actually.
Absolutely. I'm going to switch gears just a little bit. There are a couple of other questions in the Q&A, that queue, that I do hope to get back to. But we also had chatted, you and I, Kimmo, about this other side of the coin, the larger, broader institutional marketing piece that may go beyond the recruitment of student objectives that we have been talking about. In terms of that work of institutions really trying to think now, again, in these very unusual circumstances, about different approaches to telling their story, being well positioned to be a partner in an international project, or to be a standout somehow in their national context when it comes to internationalization excellence. Are there any pieces of advice or ideas that spring to mind from your side about how institutions might tackle that potentially bigger question.
Yes, I mean, I talked about that with a couple of people as well. And to start off, one could say that the telling the story. For instance, we have a lot of institutions whose brand and whose story, for instance, is very very campus related or driven even. You have a certain kind of a campus, and the physical experience of the place is very important. And we can take certain study areas like architecture. It's you study in a beautiful old school architectural school, which is part of your brand. That's the thing. You work in groups and in studios over there. Well, you can't do it now. And that's it. How do you tell that story to the students? What can you actually do? How do you do that virtually? But another thing about the story, and this is something that I've also heard from a number of universities and also read quite a bit, is the situation has alerted a lot of universities to the broader picture of higher education as a human capital and societal good, if you like. And looking at and universities have started looking at solutions and ideas of like a network university, or collaborative online international learning, for instance. Things that try to, I don't want to say compensate, because that's actually wrong, because I do believe that this is been a sort of a wake-up call actually to something that's not been so important maybe in the past, and now we've really gotten flesh around the bones of some ideas. How can we actually partner with foreign partners, international partners, to create meaningful, to create better learning and better access also to students? One interesting thing that I noticed, for instance, was that as I'm a PhD student as well and working at distance, because of the virus, because everything moved online, I had a chance to participate a lot more in meetings, in seminar groups and things like that, because of this, because they were not organized face to face anymore, and I was not able to go face to face. I was only able to participate digitally. Of course, we are talking about, one must not forget, we're talking about places where you have and people who have access.
Correct.
So that is still not the entire world.
Absolutely. And that theme of, or that question mark around equity and access has come up across a number of our sessions. I like how you did also mention, though, this notion that the wake-up call that we're experiencing really can open the door on some important thinking about things that might have been there all along, but were not fairly recognized or well recognized because there were certain circumstances that made it less necessary potentially to consider them.
Exactly.
There's a question in our Q&A box that kind of relates to that idea, at least in my mind. Do you think that some of the changes that are being implemented in this special time will stick? Are you somebody who thinks that we are experiencing a real shift in who we are and what we do in international higher education that will have a longer term impact? Or do you see this a bit more as a temporary reaction to, again, very unusual circumstances?
Once again, I think it depends, at least to an extent, to which part of higher education we're talking about. In the area of teaching and learning, I definitely think it will stick. There will be solutions that stick. So blended learning solutions and stuff like that. In other areas, for instance, marketing and recruitment, well, this has certainly put a lot of pressure on really focusing and developing your digital marketing and recruitment solutions. And obviously, I totally believe that because of that, let's say, investment that you had to put in, obviously will result in better solutions. It will result in more meaningful and better ways of digitally to market and recruit. So I do think that it does. But on the other hand, if the situation improves, I do think that we are social beings, and we do want to meet people. I mean, it would be lovely to have this conversation, uh, but it's good this way as well.
Exactly. No, we're finding our way, which is
There you
important.
go.
There is a question here, two questions actually coming from the same person that I'm going to combine into one. I think there are ways to do that. This person indicates that they've participated in some virtual fairs and have felt that there's been kind of a flatter, less robust experience with the online fair versus the in-person fair. The interaction with students is not quite the same. The same with campus familiarization opportunities that one might offer to recruitment partners or agencies. So in both of these traditionally face-to-face formats, wondering if you have some thoughts about strategies for making those something more than so far they seem to be in a virtual context.
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. That's and something that you see in other areas as well. And the let's say the root of the problem, if you like, or the challenge is that what we very often try to do is in the first phase, when we move things digitally, we simply mimic the face-to-face reality. Now, of course, you can mimic that to an extent, and there are certain aspects that you can do, but the big challenge is, how do we create it on terms of that media, on the terms of that tool, and still keep it like make it responsive and make it feel good and make it feel right. And that's the big thing. And I think, for instance, what I said, the use of alumni and making, for instance, making your group discussions small, making them intimate, having a small number of people to really engage in a meaningful conversation, like I hope we could do again today in the breakout rooms. I think that is definitely one of those ways. So you can actually have a meaningful, focused conversation, and not trying to replicate something where it's going to be a poor copy. And obviously, no one is going to like that if it's a poor copy. So that's something to be avoided as much as one can.
Absolutely. Now, you've mentioned a couple of times the breakout rooms, and as I look at the clock, we're reaching the moment in our program in which we would really like to begin that transition. So I'd like to pause our conversation for now. We will come back to you, Kimmo, in the final plenary in a number of minutes' time. But for the moment, just to say thank you for this really great kickoff conversation. It's gotten a lot of ideas on the table that, as you say, we do hope will be carried forward in the small breakout sessions. So I'll say goodbye to you for a moment and carry on with a few instructions for our participants. Yes. So at this stage, as some of you may be familiar if you've been with us previously, we will be asking you to move into a breakout session format. We'll be providing you with some guidance on ways to get that conversation started. You see some prompt questions on the screen. I'd actually like to encourage you, if you're able to take a screenshot or a photo of this slide, it may be useful. We will, of course, be feeding you these questions in the small breakout rooms, but in the case that there is a technical glitch and it's difficult to access those, we would very much like for you to have them at hand. So again, a screenshot or a phone snapshot could be useful here. We'll be asking you to think about what parts of this conversation with Kimmo have resonated with you. How are you thinking about the next generation of marketing and recruiters if we are thinking a little bit longer term about the changes in this area? And some very specific conversation could be useful about how your institution is working to tell its story over the recent period and into the future. And we are back following what I hope were some very productive breakout session discussions, and I know was certainly productive Padlet work. Kimmo and I were in contact with one another during the break, watching the board light up with lots of very interesting input. And I know there's a lot on your mind, Kimmo, as you've been reflecting on our conversation and thinking through some of the things that you've been seeing. I wonder if I could turn to you and get some reflections from you.
Sure. Yeah, look, it's just full of stuff. I just wrote so much here, and looking at the Padlet, I mean, it's so full of great ideas. Like I said earlier, this is the richness of the AI community. I took out quite a number of things actually, because I wrote them down well, to be honest, very selfishly also for myself, as they were full of lovely things here and really good stuff. A couple of things. I mean, there were a number of things, obviously, that repeated, of course. Uh, Ways to tackle student recruitment and in these times. A very nice idea for those who have overseas campuses. If your main campus is in Europe, but you have overseas campuses, or you have overseas other campuses in other countries, is of course to use those campuses now to full extent, in case your students from that area cannot travel. This is, of course, one of those restrictions currently, which is very difficult to, well, to overcome, to manage. If there are travel restrictions or quarantine restrictions, when they're there, there's not much you can do to that. Well, you need to inform about that, of course. Another interesting thing, to finding unique selling points which are not connected to, like, let's say, the physical things, the campus or so on and so forth. So what could those unique selling points be? Is a nice, a very good exercise. And of course, goes back to these issues that people were mentioning also in the chat box and in the questions Q&A of what actually constructs your brand, what is important apart from those things which are tangible and physical. And alumni were mentioned a number of times. And the use of alumni. Also in Q&A, there was a question about incentives to engage alumni. A lot of people found alumni good. One example from Padlet was also alumni created virtual tour of their experience while they were on your campus. Obviously, I would imagine, I'm imagining the idea is to give an idea, then when people eventually can join you and come to your campus, you have an alumni who's created a virtual tour of how their experience was when they were there. And I found that quite nice. It could produce really interesting things. Incentives for the alumni is, of course, something that has been discussed quite a lot in M&R, in the M&R community. Well, first of all, my experience, I must say, is that there are a lot of alumni there who are longing to reconnect with you. And that is its own reward to many of them. And I'm not saying that for everyone, but really people want to reconnect. And in these times, especially. So you approaching your alumni somewhere is extremely meaningful approach and an extremely meaningful thing to do. Obviously, you can offer rewards depending on what your institution can do, is willing to do, and can offer for your alumni, whether that is travel expenses and so on and so forth. Well, there are a number of things there that we could discuss further. Those were the couple of things I wanted to take out from both the Padlet and a little bit also on the Q&A box earlier.
Absolutely. I was very struck by a couple of things. I thought it was quite fascinating, the idea that someone put forward about potentially offering a gap year type of option to gradually draw prospective or new students in to get a flavor for what this might feel like to have a blended learning experience, for example, when that might not have been the traditional offer of an institution. It really, again, makes me think about this conversation we had yesterday with Claire O'Leary around the idea of being flexible in all kinds of ways, coming up with new ways of offering a taste of what the institution can give a student, which I thought was rather intriguing.
Absolutely, that's very good, yeah. And a lot of focus also on the actual quality of what you're let's say what you're teaching. Let's put it bluntly and simply, actual quality of what you do, and making sure that people understand what is required of them if it's a blended learning mode, and they have learning to learn skills and so on and so forth. All of that so that your students and prospective students will feel comfortable and will get an idea of, yes, this is good stuff. And even though I might not be able to, well, to be in face-to-face classes all the time, or if I need to start at distance or whatever, but still they are actually taking a lot of steps to create a good learning environment for me. And of course, the engagement comes out everywhere. Your institution's engagement to your prospective students, to the students who are about to enroll. How do you get them to enroll? And then ensuring while they are in class also that they have a community experience when they have a blended learning or a distance learning delivery that they are taking part in. So those are recurrent themes that came out all the time.
For sure. I also liked, building precisely on what you're saying. Somebody posted something along the lines of, not so much selling as really supporting students. And again, having that flow of communication.
Absolutely.
That drawing in and understanding the needs and concerns that students might have.
That's a very good point, Laura. Exactly. And of course, this is something that the marketing recruitment community talks a lot about. The selling and sales had a bit of a, it feels a bit cold, and whereas you should be, in fact, you're helping and you're responding to people's needs, what they're looking for, even in the so-called normal times, but nowadays especially. And one thing that when I looked at the comments and what we actually have is we're always talked about management of expectations. That's something we talk a lot about. But at the moment, we have a situation where it's definitely management of expectations, but it kind of blends in with crisis management, if you like. And that's the current situation from one angle. It's a combination of management of expectations and crisis management. And whereas in normal times, we've been focusing on certain, let's say, upper level needs, if you like. But many people know the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. That's a good idea, basically. So what in the normal times, we in higher education institutions, we've been able to focus on like self-actualization, right? And in STEAM, what does our degrees offer? They offer you a job. They offer you, that you get it from a reputation, a good institution with a good reputation. But what are we looking at now? People are actually worried about physiological need situation. Is it safe? Will I be sick if I go there? What do I do? So all of a sudden we need to deal with things in a different way. It's always been there, of course, but in a very acute and different way about physiology, safety, love, and belonging, for heaven's sake. So those messages are now extremely important to address. So that's something that we as marketeers might need to bear in mind as well. Just a bit of theory there. Sorry about that.
No, that's great. And also, to this point, constantly also imagining a changing scenario. So having plan B, C, and D in light of the very fluid situation in which we've been living, I think is fascinating. And yet also needing to take a longer term view that at some point this pendulum or this roller coaster may reach a different point. And how do we look toward that longer term picture? So I think those
Absolutely.
are interesting components as well.
Yeah.
We're reaching the end of a super interesting conversation, both with you in these individual conversations that have been taking place without us. I wonder if I could come back to you in a final moment here and ask you to give us a last insight, input, something you're taking away from the conversation today that's sticking with you. That would be a very welcome way, I think, for us to conclude this session.
Yeah, I mean, many of the things I think we've covered, the things that I find particularly important. But I do think that what I mentioned earlier is the importance that in the marketing recruitment also now think about our message first of all very carefully and understand that the care and the safety has a much deeper meaning now than it might have had in the past, and also the relativity of what safety is. We very typically feel safe at home, and irrespective of whether the home is in a COVID-ridden area, it's your home. That's what is important. You're not going somewhere to experience an isolation in a entirely strange and foreign situation. That's a bit horrifying. So you need to understand certain things that people and prospective students might have in mind, that even though you might feel that we're offering all of this, the psychological feeling and the psychological situation is very different. How do you address and make sure that you're addressing that? And that, I think, is very important. And then the focus on the quality of learning and creating those communities, even though we are in a blended learning or virtual mode. How do you craft a community and a social belonging in that situation? That becomes extremely important because it's also part of the feeling of safety.
Enormously important responsibilities, very exciting challenges. But as a community, I think we'll be doing some really important discussing and developing of new ideas that will lead us forward. Thank you so much for being a part of this conversation with us today, Kimmo.
Thank you for having me. This has been extremely interesting. I've learned a lot. I love this.
Lovely. Me too.